Welcome back, everybody. This is Eric and Chad here with Iraq Veteran 8888. Today we've got another Firearms Fact episode for you, and we are going to be diving into the world of Headspace. Okay, and this is I guess you would consider it a safety video, and we want to make sure that people are safe, especially with older firearms that are in varying degrees of condition. You want to ensure that they're safe and functional to indeed take them out and shoot them. We're going to go over that a bit. If you guys want to seek out any higher education in the world of firearms technology, definitely check out Sonoran Desert Institute. They are a great group of people. I know some of you guys have got unused GI Bill. Hello, I'm talking to you. They accept GI Bill. Make sure you get with them. They are a great group of people if you want to learn more detail about what we're talking about here. But we are going to go over this concept a bit. So basically, Headspace is a pretty important thing to consider. There's a lot of things on firearms that will last a really, really long time. Okay, they are very durable tools that can go the long haul. However, as they do start to age and they see a lot more use, they can begin to develop some loose tolerances in some areas. And Headspace is certainly one of the areas that you always want to make sure is in spec before you subject a firearm to any continued use.
So what is Headspace?
What is Headspace? That's a really good question. So Headspace, in a nutshell, the best way that I can explain it is what Headspace is it's a measurement specifically between the forwardmost area of the lockup of the action.
Basically the bolt face.
The bolt face. And the front of the chamber, where the cartridge headspace is off the shoulder, usually.
Datum line.
The datum line, okay.
Specifically.
Or the mouth of the case. Now, firearms headspace on very different degrees of areas on the cartridge depending on the design. Some firearms headspace off of the rim thickness as being an important measurement. A rimmed cartridge, so to speak. Some firearms headspace off of the datum line of the shoulder. Some firearms, such as pistols, headspace off the mouth of the case. If it's a rimless, non-bottleneck cartridge, generally it's going to headspace off of the mouth of the case, such as a 9mm
450 Bushmaster,
something like that. So for the case of what we're going to show here, I have a rimmed headspace gauge and a rimless headspace gauge. What happens is, and I know this is difficult to see because you can't see inside this action, but like for instance on this Mauser, okay, we've got a series of locking lugs right up here on the front of the bolt. Now this is just for this action. Not every action locks up in the same way, so that's why when it comes to firearms technology, you have to know about how all these different firearms operate, because the way they lock up determines how you're going to check headspace and things like that. But just to make this a generic explanation, I chose a bolt action because it's simple to explain. This bolt locks into the receiver in 3 different locations. You have the 2 most forward opposed locking lugs on the front of the bolt up here. Then you have a safety lug here on the back of the bolt. Don't worry about the safety lug. The safety lug is there in case these lugs fail. For the purposes of this explanation, let's just consider the forward-most locking lugs. When the bolt is locked into the receiver, it locks into dually opposed recesses in the front of the receiver. Okay? When I rotate this bolt, these 2 lugs are going to rotate this way into recesses inside the receiver. Okay, in a perfect world, each of the lugs will make full contact with the inside of the locking lug recesses in the receiver. That is how this bolt is locked in at this very moment, at this present time. As the firearm begins to have appreciable wear, either the locking lug recesses in the receiver can open up and the tolerances can change, or the locking lugs on the bolt itself can set back as well. You can also get pitting and other harm that can cause the bolt face to erode slightly from repeated pressure of the firearm firing and the cartridge pressure developing over and over and over again. Those tiny tolerance changes can then cause where this bolt originally locked up from the factory, that relationship can get pushed back a bit. That bolt could have some slop in it, right? So like if I take this bolt and lock it up and then pull it back and forth, there's a tiny bit of wiggle there, okay? Now, it's old. This gun was made in 1944, so we're pushing some age here. This is an older firearm. Now, we've got a little bit of movement, but it's safe to say that it's locked up relatively strong, okay? So, where Headspace comes into play is that now...
Well, now you've got all that excess space in there. So you're talking rifle chamber pressures exceeding 50,000 psi. Okay,
right.
That is a lot of pressure being contained by the brass cartridge case. I mean, assuming you guys are watching this video, you know what the components of a cartridge are. You got the brass cartridge case, and then you got the projectile going down the barrel, and you have all that pressure behind it that's pushing not only on the shoulder of the chamber, but also against the bolt face, and it stretches over time. And the more that stretches, you could get spikes in pressure from that expansion of that case, causing those extra pressure spikes. The longer that headspace is, the more pressure can be seen, okay, in that system. And once you get to a certain point, it can become dangerous to fire a certain firearm if it has excessive headspace that's outside of what you would consider operable headspace.
Not only do we have excessive headspace that we have to worry about, we also have to think about the jump that cartridge has to make. So say that a cartridge is chambered into a chamber and locked up into the bolt face like it's supposed to be, and say that there's a bit of a gap like he's talking about. Now we're talking about a really small gap. We have gauges which help us measure that gap. We're going to get to that in a second. But let's say that the firing pin protrusion is still far enough to set the cartridge off. Well, what's going to happen? That cartridge is going to set back. All right, now what do you want to happen? Do you want something to lock up nice and tight, fire, and then that's it? Or do you want it to fire and then move back, right? It just goes back into Newton's law of motion. Something that gathers motion will continue to have more motion. You know what I mean? An object, well, I'm not going to claim to know Newton's laws off the top of my head, but let's just say that because it sits still and then it begins to move, the effect that it has on the locking lugs and the recesses in the receiver are greatly exaggerated because it's moving. It's physically moving against the bolt face when it's under that great pressure, okay? And it just will tear the gun apart. So
it'll tear you apart if you're not careful.
It'll tear you apart if the gun lets go.
Yeah, it will.
Yeah. An object in motion tends to stay in motion. Okay? So that's what happens. That brass case is in motion. It is moving to the rear. It tends to stay in motion, which means that you don't want motion. You want it to stay still. So how do we fix this? So Brownell sells these Forster headspace gauges. All right, so we've got some headspace gauges here. There's 3 basic gauges that you're going to encounter. You're going to have a go gauge, a no-go gauge, and then a field gauge. A field gauge is like, all right, you're a soldier in the field, and if it won't close on a field gauge, okay, well, you probably don't want to shoot it like 10,000 rounds, but to go and get in a fight somewhere, you're probably okay. A no-go gauge, that's where it's like, you know, that's sort of the standard for if it closes on a no-go gauge.
It's past the excessive point.
It's past the accepted point. And a go gauge, really, I don't see a point in buying go gauges because a cartridge is a go gauge. A semi-spec cartridge is a go gauge.
The only time you'd really need a go gauge is, if I'm not mistaken, is when you're actually rebarreling or rechambering a rifle. Like you're rechambering a blank, you need a go gauge to be able to say, okay, this is the beginning of safe headspace. This is like the beginning of the spec for what I need this chamber to be.
Yeah, for rebarreling purposes. Yeah. Now, and this video, I guess, could specifically really talk about milsurps, but you should always check the headspace on any rifle, especially rifles. Pistols, you can get away with a good bit. Rifles, you certainly want to make sure you check the headspace, especially if it's a milsurp. All right, Mauser actions, you know, everybody gives the poor Mosin a hard time, and they're like, oh, well, Mosins are crap, and they're garbage rods and all this. But I've seen more Mausers fail a headspace check than I have Mosins by a long margin.
Not as many as 303 Brits, though.
303s eat. They absolutely eat headspace gauges. All right. So what we're going to do...
Finagle that thing.
What we're going to do is we're going to clip the headspace gauge into the bolt face, and we are going to chamber it. Okay? Now, I'm going to gently, without undue force, close the bolt. Okay, it stops right there. This is a field gauge. You notice that that bolt is not even close to closing. Now, I don't have a no-go gauge in 8mm Mauser. Now, you also have to know the cartridge because the gauges are specific. This is an 8mm Mauser Turkish forestry carbines. Actually, kind of a rare variant of the... we need to do a video on this gun. I would be willing to bet, just from knowing what I know about these, that if I had a no-go gauge, it wouldn't even close on a no-go gauge. So that tells me right there that the headspace on this gun is completely safe, no problems. It is safe to shoot, okay? And it's just that simple. Now, before you get into checking headspace, you want to make sure the chamber's clean. You want to make sure the locking lug recesses and the lugs on the bolt are clean. Make sure there's no grease or particulates or anything. You want to make sure the action and the chamber and everything is really clean before
Eliminate
you do
the
this.
variables.
Yes, you want to eliminate all the variables. Talk about your 303. So we've had some issues with 303. Now, 303 British is an odd cartridge. It's a great cartridge, but a lot of infields suffer from excessive headspace. So we'll talk about that a little bit. Unfortunately, we don't have an infield here to drop a gauge in.
Well, I thought that Eric had an infield here that ate a gauge. He was like, oh, no, the only one I've got, is good to go. So, like, all of mine eat gauges, like, big time.
We'll go ahead and start, and I'll grab that gun. We'll gauge it
All right, so a good visual representation of a 303 eating a gauge, okay? With these rimmed cartridges, okay, as we mentioned earlier in the video, the various cartridge types, they will gauge off of different areas on the brass. In the case of a rimmed case, you're actually gauging the thickness of the rim and the space between the face of the barrel and the face of the bolt itself. That's your headspace measurement. You're not really taking a measurement off the datum. And one thing that we didn't mention early on too is also like Magnum belted cartridges. They've got the large belt around the base of the case, around the case head. The headspace measurement is from the forward part of the belt to the bolt face on that particular gun. But good visual representation. This is a piece of fired brass. Believe this came out of the number 5. Yes, it did. This came out of the Jungle Carbine. This is a L.E. Wilson case gauge. This is basically just a small tool. It's great for reloaders to gauge the sizing of your brass and such in situations where you're reloading ammunition. And basically this is a mirror image of a semi-spec chamber, more or less. And you've got minimum and maximum measurements that are kind of cut into the gauge itself, so you can visually see, how you're sizing your shoulders back, whether or not that brass is long enough to get the correct overall length to be able to fit your chamber and everything like that. We drop that case in there and you can clearly see how that rim is protruding out of the back of this case.
It means it's blowing that shoulder forward a lot.
And another way of measuring that is using a comparator tool. This is a Hornady comparator tool that I'm using on a set of digital calipers from Michitoyu. Basically what we do is we can take a brand new case. Okay, this is an unfired, just a PPU soft point, all right? We're gonna get our measurement, and what this tool does is it measures off of the shoulder of the case, the center of the shoulder. So we're gonna zero that measurement. So we have our measurement from the base of the case up to the middle of the shoulder. Now we're gonna take our fired case, all right, and this blew the shoulder forward a good bit, and we're gonna see exactly how much that chamber is in excess headspace. About 36 thousandths.
Right.
So when you're shooting like military rifles that are suffering from excess headspace, you can shoot these guns, okay, but you just have to be careful and know your limitations. Now what I do with this brass is I just neck size this brass, and then every now and again I'll hit it with a body die. But one of the big problems with excessive headspace, especially when you're talking 30, 40 thou excessive headspace, is what happens is the case head starts to stretch. When the round goes off, firing pin hits the primer, the case is stretching both ways, right? So you're getting those opposing forces, and the brass is malleable, yes, but you're still stretching the thickest part of the brass. And over time, you can develop a small internal fracture there, and then you could have a case head failure, which we'll talk about, a particular instance that we captured on film with that in a few moments here. But that gives you kind of a visual representation of what excessive headspace actually looks like. It's just the cartridge case growing inside the chamber, and then the pressure spiking a bit and causing problems, down the line if you don't really know what you're doing.
Do you have your 303 gauge?
I do not have it, no.
I've got one.
So
I'll go grab a 303 gauge. We'll gauge this real quick. Tell them about the Madison.
Okay, so we were out shooting this Madison, all right, and I had loaded up a bunch of 30-06 on some Greek surplus brass that was once fired. I believe we shot it out of we may have shot it out of a couple of Springfields, like 1903s, if I'm not mistaken. But I took this brass, cleaned it up, sized it. I made sure that The case heads were good on everything, pretty much just spot checked about 1 in every 10 cases here and there. And this brass was old. It was like 60 surplus. So I loaded up some 168 grain Match Kings on Varget, if I'm not mistaken. And we went out and we shot like the 1917. And that sucker was shooting great. We shot, 1903 A3. And then I had some of this ammo left. I was like, let's see how it shoots out of the Madison. All right, so we're out shooting this stuff. And it's shooting pretty good, okay? And then all of a sudden, what happens is Eric's at the bench, and then boom, had just a puff of smoke come out of the action, and we're like, whoa, what's going on? Bolt locked up, and we had a case head failure. And come to find out, that rifle was not Headspace before we took it out and shot it. And we were just kind of excited to get out to the range and everything, and it had very excessive headspace. And come to find out, after doing a little bit of research on the gun, that they suffer from excessive headspace. It's kind of just a normal thing.
It's a known thing.
Yeah. So, and we didn't know that. So we wound up, we didn't have any ammo that we could run on the thing. It wasn't safe to shoot, obviously, but this was old, just old surplus brass. And yes, the brass itself could have been a little bit brittle, but compound that situation with the excess of headspace, and then you've got a recipe for disaster. And luckily, this was a very mild load. When I'm loading for old surplus guns, I typically keep it kind of on the mild to moderate spectrum. I don't go near the top end. I usually keep it pretty sedate, just because I want my rifles to last, and I want to be able to enjoy them with cheaper ammunition.
It's also why it's important to wear iPro.
Absolutely.
When you're at, especially with older guns, you never know when gonna let go.
But the head of the case just literally let go, and then all that extra pressure that you're containing, trying to contain, vented out of the action. And it was pretty dang scary, but it happens, All
right, well, I was wrong. It closed on the field.
Oh, I told you.
So, look, I'm telling you guys, these infields, they will almost always close on a no-go gauge, if not a field gauge. So this gun closed on a field gauge, which means it's really not safe to shoot.
Well, I still shoot mine, but
neck size.
I neck size only. I fire 1 round out of them, and then I literally shot like 60 rounds, and that's all the brass that I need to be able to reload that rifle for probably as much as I'm going to shoot it.
You can also do like a really light fire forming load that's real gentle on the gun, and it'll fire form the shoulder out.
That's actually
and then
safer.
Create your own, basically you're creating custom brass for that gun. If you have a gun with excessive headspace, that's probably the way to go about it if you just really want to shoot it.
Did we ever
now,
do
this
a
is a
video on
grenade
that?
launching rifle, so I don't know if headspace is terribly important on a grenade launching rifle because it's designed to use special blanks and...
Well, when you mentioned to me that gun was tight, I'm thinking, how could that gun be tight if they were launching grenades with those hot blanks?
Well, that's just the thing. I was wrong, but I've shot it. Never had a problem. You learn something every day, guys. Well, anyway, so that's what, I've got a field gauge closing on this infield all the way, so definitely not good. Now, those bolt heads can be replaced, and that's a whole other thing.
Well,
but in fields, you can get the bigger bolt heads.
Well, in theory, you can get them. The higher number bolt heads, which are longer bolt heads to combat excessive headspace in the infields, are like non-existent. So,
let's gauge the Swede.
Gauge the Swede, and then I've got a more modern headspace story to tell you, which, it's just one of those things where, crap happens, and people make mistakes. So, stay tuned. Don't go anywhere. Gauge that Mauser. Now, that thing should be good to go. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
That's a field gauge.
Yeah.
6.5 by 55 Swedish.
Thing's got a lot of wiggle room left.
That's right. So, our Swedish Mauser's in good shape. All right, let's test the Mosin.
The Moist Nugget.
And you notice that the difference is you have a big, thick rim on a rimmed headspace gauge versus a rimless. They look like little cartridges. Okay. I went ahead and just pulled the extractor here on the 9130. This is a 1930 9130.
She's getting
which
old.
Means what?
It's just gotten used.
It means it's the first year the 9130 was made. It was made in 1930. All right, we're going to put the bolt head back on.
It means it's been used.
It certainly has. Okay. Now we should be able to drop our headspace gauge right on in there, just like this.
Bloop.
All right, that's a field gauge.
Hey! We still got some life left.
Safe to shoot. Okay? All right, and then to put that extractor back in, we'll just...
Do you have to watch a YouTube video on that?
I made the YouTube video.
I was waiting for it.
All right, and then that lines up.
Oh no.
I'm all thumbs.
Oh no.
What am I going to do? All right. So our Mosin and our Swedish Mauser are good to go. The infield ate the Headspace gauge. If that tells you anything.
I still shoot mine.
That's all right.
All right, so by this time, I think you guys got a pretty good idea of what Headspace is, why it's important, and it's probably the most critical measurement for safety of any given firearm.
Oh yeah.
Even more so than like whether the rifling is missing out of the barrel. I mean, that is just, Headspace is very, very important. Now, I have one last Headspace story to tell you, and this one's this one was a little bit of a bear to figure out at first. I wasted some expensive brass, but so I started this project. Let me grab the rifle. All right, this little rifle right here. All right, we'll sit on the table.
Here, go ahead.
All right,
here, let's move this thing out of the way.
Get that thing out of the way. All right, so this is a modern sporting rifle. I hate that term. So this is a AR that I did up in a Wildcat called 6mm AR, also known as 243 LBC or 6mm Grendel. All right, so it takes a 6.5 Grendel case and it necks the cartridge down to 6mm to 243. So you're going from 264 to 243. And this particular rifle, I'm loading 105s at like 2,700 feet per second. I wanted a custom barrel from Excalibur because that's where I got the 224 Valkyrie barrel from, and it shot great when I got the right twist and everything. But I wanted to move on from that project, so I ordered a reamer from PT&G. Okay, I sent it to them. They custom produced the barrel for me, and they Headspace it at the factory. And I just ordered a bolt to go with it. And the Grendel Bolts at the time, I didn't know that there was two different bolts, okay? There's a standard Grendel bolt, and then there's what they consider like a Type 2, or there's a Type 1 and a Type 2, and it's beyond the scope of this video, but the bolt face depths are different. One of them is 0.136 inches, the other one is 0.125. And if I'm not mistaken, the 125 is more of the standard measurement for like 5.56 bolts and everything like that. Well, needless to say, I received the wrong bolt with my barrel. So I received the one that was deeper. And when I started fire forming some brass, I wound up getting like almost like a magnum belt on my brass. I'm like, what in the world is going on? I took my estimated starting charge, I backed it down a decent amount, and was chronographing everything. And I wound up doing an optimal charge weight test with H4895 powder, and I switched to a different powder just to see if maybe I was just getting excessive pressure issues, just something crazy. And I got to thinking about it, and I checked the overall length of the case from the base up to the shoulder using the comparator, and my cases were growing by like 11 to 13 thousandths. And a light bulb went off, and I'm like, wait a minute. All right, so I measured the bolt face depth, and sure enough, I had the wrong bolt. So it was just a mistake that was made when my barrel was shipped out. They Headspaced it with, the proper bolt, but they just grabbed a bolt out of stock, that was supposedly the same, and I guess dropped it in my box. But they remedied the issue. I got the proper bolt in, and the Lapua brass, the Lapua brass. This brass is made exceptionally well, and it can handle like 30% overpressure. If I'm not mistaken, they test it to 30% overpressure to make sure that it's going to hold up. And I'm glad they did that, because I could have had, a case head failure, and I could have damaged my rifle. I could have damaged myself in the situation, and it was just because I didn't have Headspace gauges of my own just to double check this custom build, which is something that with 5.56 stuff you really don't need to do, because the way the AR barrels are Headspace is they're Headspace with the extensions installed. So they'll install the extension, hard pin it in place, and then it's Headspaced from there once it's hard pinned. And usually you can get a matched bolt with it that's Headspaced with the gun. But like I said, after I got that situation remedied, my brass was only growing by like a thousandths in every direction. So the chambering was basically made to this brass specifically. And I'm already on my 8th loading of my first lot of this brass, and the rifle's been shooting excellent since then. I've got about 1,000 rounds through it, but that is why you want a Headspace custom builds and just invest it's $100 or so for a set of 3, like from PT&G or other reputable manufacturers. But if you're gonna do something crazy like this, or especially even Grendel, because of the confusion out there with the bolt head depths, I would suggest investing in a set of gauges, which I did after the fact, and I haven't even had to use them. So
there's some, modern examples of Headspace issues. So hopefully this video kind of points you guys in the right direction. I would strongly recommend anybody who is a Milsurp nut like me, I would invest. I've rarely seen Swedish Mausers have Headspace issues. I've ran into a bunch of them over the years, never had a problem. 6.5 Swede, probably don't need to bother having one unless you just really want to, but I would strongly recommend an 8mm Mauser field gauge and a 303 British field gauge at a bare minimum, especially if you're going around shopping for 8mm Mauser rifles that are surplus. If you're at gun shows, any reputable seller will let you slip a gauge into the gun to make sure that it's good. But I'd recommend a 303 and 8mm. If you buy a lot of 54R cartridge guns, such as Mosin's, you could probably invest in a 54R Headspace gauge in a field variety. But I've rarely seen a Mosin eat a Headspace gauge.
It's definitely rare. I mean, especially with the fins. I mean, you're almost guaranteed you're not going to see a fin that eats a Headspace gauge.
I've never seen it in my years of collecting them and shooting them.
I would say too, like K31s, most surplus like 308s, anything that's 7.62 by 51, you might want to invest in a gauge for that. It would be handy, especially some of the harder use guns. But it is something. It is a tool to have in the box. Just in general, especially if you're a collector, and especially if you want to shoot these guns. If you're just buying them to collect them for their intrinsic value, that's one thing. You probably don't need a Headspace gauge laying around, but if you shoot them like we do, we like to bring these things back to life, definitely a small investment to make, at least in a field gauge.
I would strongly recommend a field gauge in a 7.62 by 51 and a 5.56. Either a field or I'd say probably even no-go. Because if you are a person who builds ARs, whether you're building a 7.62 by 51 and an AR-10, or you're building a 5.56 and just a regular AR-15 type platform, it's probably not a terrible idea when you get done with a fresh build to at least slip a no-go gauge in it and just see if it closes. It shouldn't. You should not have a problem. There's a wide variety of different opinions as to what people say whether or not you should check Headspace on a fresh build. If you just want to be super cautious, slip a no-go gauge in it. Yeah. It's probably not going to close. Otherwise, look at the brass and let the brass will always tell you the story.
I've Headspaced probably 2 of my 5.56 rifles ever, that I've put together. But
me too.
The only exception to that rule was this gun, but it did have some underlying variables with the cartridge that I chose, basically just because of the case and the 2 different types of bolts. If it wasn't for the 2 different types of bolts out there, then it wouldn't have been a problem, most likely.
And remember, too, that the brass will always tell the story.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay? If you're a hand loader and you're shooting these old guns, or if you're a hand loader and you're shooting modern guns, always, the first couple of rounds you fire for a fresh batch of hand loads, always look at the brass. Check for, the brass is going to tell you a lot of things. You'll get primer flow. You get primer set back if the headspace is excessive. You'll get excessive brass flow in the shoulder area. You might get case head separation. You may get, like you'll notice, if it's like a plunger style extractor on the back, you may notice like a little divot where it's pushing back real hard. So the brass will give you some clues as to what's going on with the gun. Always pay attention to the way the brass looks coming out. You can tell a lot just from that. Or case head separation. So guys, thanks for watching today's video. I know it was a little bit long, but hopefully you guys enjoyed it and learned something. We could go into so far down the rabbit hole if we really wanted to, but this is just to scratch the surface about Headspace and why it's important to know what it is and to check it and everything like that. If you procure especially an older firearm and you don't know how to check the Headspace, or if you don't have the necessary tools, always take an older gun to a reputable gunsmith and have them check it out to make sure it's safe to shoot before you shoot it. Guys, these guns aren't getting any younger. and we've got to make sure we do our part to make sure they're not going to fall apart when they're shot. So always do the due diligence and make sure that they're checked before you shoot them.
Do the maintenance!
Do the maintenance! That's right. Mark Novak coming out. Guys, thank you so much for watching. We appreciate all of you. Thank you if you are one of our Patreon supporters. If you purchase man cans or shirts and merchandise over on the website to help support the channel, thank you so much for seeing value in what we do and supporting our channel. All those funds go right back into supporting this type of content. So thank you guys very much. Many more videos on the way. We'll see you next time.
See you guys.